Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the webinar, which we've created in conjunction with our Offshore and Floating Wind Europe 2019 conference, which will be running in this November. We've got a great webinar to share with you today. We're looking at opportunities that are opening up in the key global markets around the world, and as we move towards 2050 through 2030, there's a forecast 500 plus gigawatts of new developments scheduled to happen, and we're all really excited to see where on earth they're actually going to be taking place. So we've got two good panelists today, and our presenters are Gunnar Herzig, who is the Managing Director and Co-Founder of the World Forum Offshore Wind. He was previously at RWE, the German utility. So Gunnar created the WFO as a non-profit organisation with the goal of promoting offshore wind energy worldwide. We'll also be hearing from Clement Weber, who's the founder of Green Giraffe, and Clement has been leading transactions on the debt and the equity side for about a decade. And he's worked on a number of different projects, both fixed bottom and more recently floating, and we're going to be learning a couple of the key lessons that he's brought from them today, and that are going to help us with our future developments as we go worldwide. So we want sort of lots of questions today as you're listening along to the webinar. We'll be taking them at the end with both Clement and Gunnar answering, and but yeah, feed them in as you go, and I'll make notes and we can get to it there. So, without further ado, I will invite Gunnar to share his screen, and we can start the webinar there.
Great, thank you very much, Dominic. I hope everyone can see my screen now. Great. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Great pleasure to participate in today's webinar. My name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of the newly founded World Forum Offshore Wind, short WFO. And let me just start with a quick introduction of what we are. So as Dominic already said, we are a newly founded non-profit organization, and we indeed promote offshore wind energy worldwide. And so we focus exclusively on offshore wind, no onshore wind, no other marine technologies. It's really offshore wind only, but on a global scale. And we as an organization also have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore. And on the bottom of the slide, you can see our members, and they really represent the complete offshore wind value chain and also quite a nice international diversification. So our members include utilities such as E.ON, Northland Power or Energy, but also advisory firms such as Green Giraffe or Marsh, for example. And among our members, we also have some regional associations, for example, the US Business Network for Offshore Wind, the Asia Wind Energy Association, or the UK's ORE Catapult. So yeah, what is our mission? What are we trying to achieve? That is really to achieve adding 500 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity globally by 2050. And that mission is based on a projection by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, which sees the potential of offshore wind at 520 gigawatts by 2050. And since we have roughly around 20 gigawatts already installed globally at this moment in time, this means adding around 500 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity over the next 3 decades. And that obviously involves also large-scale floating offshore wind farms, which need to be a big part of that addition over the next decades. And it also really requires a global effort to put the world on an accelerated growth path for offshore wind in order to reach this target and to thus adequately contribute to global CO2 reductions. So why did we set up WFO at this point in time? That was really driven by the tremendous change the industry had made, especially over the past couple of years, which was really driven by the significant cost reductions that were achieved, especially by the auctions we've seen in some European countries around 2015-16, most notably auctions in Germany, Denmark, the UK, and also the Netherlands, where costs came down to a level that was unimaginable only 5, let alone 10 years ago. And that cost reduction really sparked this global expansion of offshore wind beyond Europe, because until then it had mainly been a European industry. But over the past couple of years, it really exploded and became this global movement. So now we see offshore wind happening in the US on the East Coast as well as West Coast going forward, and also in many Asian markets such as Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and also in some markets where we see developments already being planned, such as India or Vietnam. And therefore, we're now really looking at this global industry. And I'll be happy to go into some of the details of specific countries in a moment. So let's start with a focus on what's going on the US East Coast. So we finally see some big announcements being made over the past couple of months in the US. And that was really great news, because it's always important to keep in mind that right now we only have one single offshore wind farm in the US, off the US East Coast of Rhode Island, the Blockwind offshore wind farm, which has only 30 megawatts. So quite small, and therefore it's all the more impressive to now see the auction results that only came in over the past couple of months, the results from the New York State auction and the New Jersey auction. And here you can see some of the announcements made by the winners following those auction result announcements. Equinor, for example, from Norway, from Statoil, they won as part of the New York State auction, and they won with a massive project, 816 megawatts, around $3 billion in investment, and thought to be commissioned around 2024. And a very similar project in terms of size was won by Ørsted, the Sunrise Wind project, even slightly larger, 880 megawatts. And here we have a 50-50 partnership between Ørsted from Denmark and then a local partner, Eversource, from the US. So interesting approach there, to partner with a local company definitely makes sense. And this project is also planned to be commissioned around 2024. And Ørsted, in another announcement following the New Jersey auction, announced the start of an even bigger project, 1,100 megawatts, for the Ocean Wind project off the coast of New Jersey, and also being planned to be commissioned around 2024. And I think what is really striking about those East Coast announcements in the US is actually the size of the projects that we see. So 800 to more than 1,000 megawatts per project, given that we currently only have 30 megawatts, that really shows us how the US in a way jumped the curve and immediately went from the very small sort of pioneer projects, as we see was the Block Island project, to very large scale project. So they really make full use of all the lessons learned that have been made in Europe with all the developments over the past years, and go straight to very large scale projects. And I think that looks very promising with those announcements. And therefore, I think the industry is really excited to see what will be happening on the US East Coast going forward. So now let's take a look at the West Coast. So currently still a bit behind the East Coast, but I think we've seen some very promising announcements made by BOEM, the US's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, when they published their call for information and nominations for commercial wind farm leases in California at the end of last year. And they proposed 3 areas, which you can see on the left-hand side of the coast of California, which could be developed and investigated. And we then actually saw quite some serious interests in the market. So 14 companies, which you can see on the right-hand slide, expressed their interest and were deemed qualified in now taking a closer look at those sites. And I think what was quite promising was, on the one hand side, that we're here talking about floating offshore wind. So the West Coast would be way too deep in terms of water depth for conventional bottom-fixed offshore wind. So here we're already talking about floating offshore wind developments. And the kind of response that we got from the market was actually very diverse, with a lot of companies from the established markets in Europe, but also North America. And I think this kind of interest in a floating offshore wind market is really quite encouraging, and I think underlines the the momentum that we see in the floating market, which is really making excellent progress. And I think it really shows how much global interest there is in pushing for new markets, as is the case with California. So let's now turn to Japan. So Japan, actually made a very interesting announcement only last week when the Japanese government selected a total of 11 sites, so-called promotion sites. And of those 11 sites, four sites were actually considered to be in an advanced stage. And those 4 sites are now being prepared for auctions, which will be happening soon. And of those 4 sites, which are going to be prepared for auctions, 3 sites are bottom fixed, conventional offshore wind, and 1, the Goto project, is actually floating offshore wind. And then we have an additional 7 sites, which were considered to not be quite ready for auctions at this point in time, which needs some further development, but should then hopefully go into an auction process soon afterwards. And I think this was actually quite an important step for the Japanese market, because Japan has always been a country that everybody in the industry was closely following and was very interested and excited about. But so far, the regulatory clarity was missing to some extent. And I think this announcement was quite promising, identifying those 11 sites. So now we know what kind of sites we're talking about. And I think this was indeed good news for the Japanese market. And Japan has already created a great interest among the industry. Ørsted, for example, has already signed a joint venture agreement with TEPCO from Japan, and E.ON is also already quite involved in the Japanese market, having signed a memorandum of understanding also with the Japanese utility. And therefore, I think everybody is really very excited about the Japanese market. Also, given the fact that, given Japan's big industrial background, it would be quite easy for Japan to come up with a domestic supply chain. They would have all the industry necessary to develop an offshore wind supply chain. In addition to that, they have a big banking sector, so it would be not too difficult to raise all the finances for such projects. So in total, Japan, very promising market, which made some important announcements just last week. And therefore, I think definitely a market everybody is closely following. So if we now move to Korea, I think Korea quite similar to Japan in terms of having initiated some promising developments. Just recent developments have been made by the Green Investment Group, now owned by Macquarie, as well as Equinor from Norway. And in the case of the Green Investment Group, we saw that they actually installed the first floating LiDAR to measure actual wind conditions in the area, in the particular space that they have identified as promising in Korea. And if the wind measurements are promising and successful, the plan is to build a massive 1.4 gigawatt project. And the first phase of this massive project, around 400 megawatts, would be planned to be commissioned maybe in 2022, if all the LiDAR measurements are promising. But I think that was actually quite an interesting announcement. And Equinor, on the other hand, announced to be developing a floating offshore wind farm in South Korea, together with 2 local partners, the Korea National Oil Corporation and the Korea East-West Power Company. And together with those partners, they are now thinking about developing a 200 megawatt floating offshore wind farm, also planned to go into construction in the early 2020s. So I think this again highlights that we do see serious activities in Korea. And I think similar to Japan, Korea would be an ideal country for offshore wind, having a big industrial background and base and financing capabilities. So I think quite similar in terms of positioning to Japan, and also indeed one of the top Asian offshore wind markets. So if we now look at Taiwan, we can actually see, probably the most advanced and internationally open market for offshore wind in Asia. And Taiwan has already seen its first FID announcements, which were only made a couple of months ago. So we saw Ørsted taking the FID for their massive Changhua 1 and 2A offshore wind farm, which has 900 megawatts of capacity. and construction is planned to start in 2021. And interestingly, the Changhua project is also the first one that falls under the new localization rules. So now we're entering the phase where projects have to have a certain amount of local content, and this project is already part of that, which means that we now see very serious and promising initiatives to develop a Taiwanese supply chain, and the entire industry is very much engaged in that and making sure that we do have first-class suppliers and that we do have an excellent local supply chain, which will then be needed not only for this project, but for all the projects in Taiwan going forward. And a second announcement was made by the German developer WPD for the FID for their Yunlin project. And the Yunlin project is a joint venture owned by WPD and 5 Japanese electricity and oil and gas companies. And they own 27% of the project. And the Yunlin project is also very large in size, 640 megawatts, also going to come online quite soon in 2021. And interestingly, here we already see the first project financing that has been achieved. So 2.7 billion euros have already been put together by banks in order to finance the project. And I think this is also quite promising that we already see the kind of financing structures which are already quite common in Europe now to be applied in new markets already. And WPD has done that very successfully with their Yunlin project. And here again, I think very interesting to see how the Taiwanese market is moving forward. We've seen some very, I think, clear regulation in Taiwan, and that really immediately sparked great international interest. So everybody went to Taiwan in order to develop projects. And I think given that we now see things moving forward, first FIDs for very large projects being taken, this is a very good sign for the Taiwanese market and should definitely encourage more developments in this market going forward. So if we now go back to the question, how do we open new markets and what does it take to open new markets? I think there are really 3 things. First of all, you have to be present in the new market. So you have to be there, you have to speak at events, go to conferences, set up an office ideally, and really engage with the market, because you cannot just expect things to be happening when you're based in your office on another continent. So you need to be there locally, and just learn about what this country is about. And you also, in a second point, need to know about the regulation. So understanding the regulatory framework, talking to regulators, trying to find out sort of how things might be developing in the future is extremely important, as the regulatory framework is obviously always the backbone of every project. That needs to be properly understood in any new market. Therefore, that is definitely important, understanding the regulations. And as a third aspect, gathering market information would be extremely important, knowing who potential partners might be, knowing more about the supply chain, and just understanding what doing business in this particular country means. And if you can do that as you are as a company, or if you might need any help or any particular competencies which are required for this particular market, that is also quite important. And then we as WFO, as an organization trying to promote offshore wind globally, we do our best to help with all those 3 aspects, trying to create possibilities for our members and for companies to be present in those new markets, to better understand the regulation. We also talk to regulators and policymakers in those places to understand what exactly is the regulation about, where is it heading, what kind of obstacles might there be, can we bring in any lessons learned from some of the established offshore wind markets. And lastly, providing information on new markets, on the supply chain, on players in this country. So that's definitely something we as WFO always try to help with, and in that sense to bring the industry forward and to achieve our goal of adding 500 gigawatts by 2050. So that was it from my side. Very happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Gunnar. Thank you for that introduction then. And yes, very exciting. Lots of development in a lot of different global markets, and Also, it's good to know that there is a lot of support out there. The three items that you went for, being present, understanding the regulatory and understanding the market as well. There is a lot of help out there, and there's also a lot of items that people need to know, and a lot of different markets are very different specific conditions. So good to have you on board and helping people with that. Clement, now I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to invite you to share your screen and give your insights.
Hello, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're in Asia. Clément speaking. So indeed, I'm one of the founders of Giraffe, and I want to share today more the transactional experience on projects, what has worked in our old markets in Europe, and what is different in the new markets, because a lot can be learned from a previous experience. A lot can be put in place in the new markets, but also there are some specificities that we all have to keep in mind. So maybe let me check that. So the presentation is quite dense, but Gunnar has been exactly on time. It's at 20 minutes. I do the same and highlight the main lessons, and keep maybe more details for the questions later at the end of it. Very quick point on Green Giraffe. So we are the #1 financial advisor in renewables, and very focused on offshore wind, as well as onshore wind and solar PV. But offshore wind has been really our route. We have closed multiple transactions in debt and equity. Well, mostly around the North Sea, because this is where the market is currently. But in the last 2-3 years, we have also been very involved in many other markets, including the US. Well, speaking just about offshore wind, the US, Japan, where we have two mandates currently, South Korea, and Taiwan, where we are helping Northland Power and Mitsui, and we have opened an office in South Africa and now in Boston. So moving directly to the core of it, the key lessons learned from Europe and how we've made offshore wind such a success in the countries around, well, mostly around the North Sea. First one, project finance has been used a lot in offshore wind, and not only project finance as in non-recourse debt, but also project finance as debt plus equity, considered as standalone for the project. And the key things to make it work is to have a dedicated project company for the project, with each relationship between the company and the different stakeholders being very clearly contracted, and a clear interface between each contract, so that the risks are allocated to those who can take them the most. Indeed, there are two ways to finance projects, the same in every infrastructure sector, but also applying in offshore wind. So either, which has mainly been used by utilities in the sector, the sponsors directly investing on balance sheet in the project company and taking potentially some corporate loans at their level, but only investing all the cash to the project company coming from them, or indeed the non-recourse debt, so the debt directly provided to the project company on a non-recourse basis. So if something goes wrong, the debt provider is taking the hit as well, and cannot go back to the sponsors and ask for their money back. What is quite impressive with offshore wind is that from very early in the sector, as early as 2006, non-recourse debt has been used. So the banks have been open to lend to a new sector, and obviously that's something I will come back to for the new countries. But it's fair to say that the banks have taken their part of the risk under certain strict conditions very early in the development of the offshore wind sector. Key risks, development phase, all the permitting risks, tariff contracts, and financing risk. During the construction phase, which has been in offshore wind, really where the focus was for a long time, and still is, if you look at the premium paid for a construction, even if it has decreased a lot over the years, and operational risk, including wind risk. All of those being carefully mitigated by technical, legal, contracting, insurance, and financing mitigants. I won't go back to it into details, but it's the key thing to be noted, and we'll go back to it for the new countries and new sectors, is to make sure that all the risks are correctly mitigated. Gunnar already mentioned it. It's very impressive how fast the sector managed to bring the cost of offshore wind down. You can see in the graph here that most of the projects now in Europe are either what we call a zero subsidy bid, so without any public support, or with very low price of a CFD or a feed-in tariff that is basically more or less aligned or the same as the price of electricity in the different countries. So offshore wind is more and more competitive. And finally, in the lessons learned, before moving on to what we can take from it to go to new countries and new sectors, there is appetite from the investors, and not the same investors will want to invest in projects at every stage of development, but there is appetite at each stage of development. Early development, late development, construction and operation. If you know at what stage the project wants to be financed, there is currently in the market a pool of capital with enough appetite at each stage of development in offshore wind. So now offshore wind in new countries. This is more or less in line with what Gunnar just explained. So the historical countries are more the countries around the North Sea, so the UK, number one, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark. The new countries developing, or let's say the new markets, those who already have schemes in place to develop offshore wind are mainly the US, France, Poland, well, China. It's a bit of a special case, obviously, for foreigners, but maybe easier for international investors and developers. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and potential future developments in other countries, like in Mediterranean Sea with floating, or India, Australia, or even Brazil and Chile. So first consideration, and that's obviously the financiers speaking here, but the LCOE I should not consider to be exactly the same as or as low as we currently see in Europe. for different reasons. It is new, and there is a novelty premium that is paid in these new markets, mainly linked to the DevEx, so everything that has to be put in place to develop the projects, whereas in the old market, a lot has already been done. The teams have been put in place already, have been developed. So having it in a new market is an additional cost. The regulatory risk for new markets that have not been tested yet is also something that will be reflected in a higher LCOE. Financing costs, also reflecting the risk of basically the novelty risk. The financing costs will be higher in new markets, and everything around logistic, harbor, actually developing the industry in the new countries. Even if most of the new countries in offshore wind are very developed countries, Japan, the US, South Korea, Taiwan, still developing the industry in those countries is something that one takes time, and secondly has a cost. One is so there is a premium for in the LCOE that is considered for the new market. Actually, our first simulations and what we have seen in the new countries in offshore wind so far is that this premium is surprisingly low. So there is still a premium, but we can consider that it doesn't double or triple the price as some could have expected when we go to a completely new countries. But it's more a matter of having an LCOE, a cost of offshore wind, that is slightly higher than what we have seen in Europe, which is very good news for the sector and the development worldwide. What shall we look at when we go to a new jurisdiction? Our methodology is to mainly look at 5 different things. The first one is the country context. So is there a regulatory framework in place? What is the country risk? Is there a supply chain? Is there a currency risk? How do we deal with the currency? Can we lend in euro or dollar, or has it to be, or should we do it in the local currency? And what is the possibility to swap between currencies? Secondly, is there a rationale for the project? So what is the economic benefit of the project for the country, the population? Are we in a country where we can build very cheap onshore wind and PV, and therefore does it make sense to pay more to install offshore wind if we have other alternatives that are cheaper and easily available? And the technical conditions. So is there a case for installing offshore wind, basically a strong wind, good soil, being careful about earthquake, typhoon, or tsunamis? All these questions have to lead developers going to new countries. The third one is the state of development. So engagement with the local community, so the permitting, what is the status, and also importantly, what is the permitting path to having the project fully permitted? Grid connection is a key one. PPA in most of the countries, so either public or private PPAs. What is the technology that is chosen? And maybe the key question right now is, do we use traditional offshore wind, fixed or floating? And the construction contracts. Fourth, and also very important, the team, and including a mix usually with international team with the capability and experience in offshore wind and the local people on the ground, the experience of the advisors and of the contractors. And finally, obviously that's more my sector, but still not to be forgotten, financial. What is the business case? Is it basically profitable to build an offshore wind project in the new country, depending on all the entrants and the data? What is needed? How much is needed? And what is the control? And potentially what is the consortium and the cooperation that can be put in place between an international partner with deep pocket and experience in offshore wind and local developers who know everything about the local community, the fishermen, and the local context, and sometimes even the language can be quite key to develop projects. What we have seen so far in the new countries is basically exactly the same in terms of revenues as what we have seen in Europe. So the 4 different revenue schemes, either purely merchant revenues. We're currently seeing it in the US, for example. Several projects are being developed in Hawaii, in California, under the assumption that it will be purely merchant, and then the electricity will be sold to the market or using private PPAs, corporate PPAs or utility PPAs. The second one is a feed-in tariff, like in Taiwan, Japan. CFD, so contract for difference, like in France or in Poland, or the renewable obligation, so a bit like what we had at the ROC system in the previous UK scheme, which is the one, for example, that has been chosen by South Korea. So all these revenue regimes are now being seen in new markets. So that's the first point. Second one, permitting process, very important in new markets to understand what the permitting looks like, and if it will be if everything will be put in place so that it can be kept relatively short, so 3, 4, 5 years and not 10 or 15. Obviously the key example, being French myself, that I know well is France, that has started in 2011 and still there is nothing built there, mostly because of how long the permitting process and recourse on permits have been. So that's one of the key points to take into consideration. PPA, I've already discussed it. So depending on the revenue regime, having a clear path to selling the electricity is absolutely key. And finally, the more technical geophysics and wind studies, whether it can be provided in a centralized way, and if there is good technical advisors who can provide them, or if it is something to be completely developed from scratch. And last point in this section about floating, a lot of the countries that are developing very fast in offshore wind, including South Korea, Japan, and the US, have a significant part of what can be developed that is in very deep waters. And the development floating is therefore very linked to the development of offshore wind in general in these countries. Good news is that the technical solutions are now ready for the most advanced technologies. Pilot wind farms are being built, actually the industry expects floating, the cost is still higher right now, but expects the cost of floating to be competitive with traditional offshore wind by 2030, which would be quite a rapid catch-up for floating. I'm conscious of time, so I'll be quick to reach the conclusion. I think the recommendation in development, just being aware that obviously there is a risk return, as I said, that is in all sectors, but also in offshore wind. So 3 steps. The first one is to have a fully permitted, what we call a shovel-ready project, when all the permits are in place, including grid connection, the revenue regime, and site control. The second step is to reach FID, financial close, so everything is in place to start the construction. And the third one is to reach COD, so the commercial operating date, while the project is generating power. Current stage is in most of the new countries is between early and mid development. And this is what I wanted to have a few words about. Something important at that stage is the cooperation and the co-development options between international experienced partners and local developers, because knowing the local having the local knowledge is extremely important to develop in the new countries, but also having experience in offshore wind in general is what would make it successful. So having the two partners working together is something important. There are several ways. Again, I won't enter too much into details at this stage, but there are several ways to structure it from a financial point of view. It's something that we are doing a lot at the moment with several local developers and international partners. I think the key message here is that yes, it is the best way to develop the project successfully, to build with international players and local parties. And yes, there is an appetite for it, and yes, there are ways, depending on what the partners, how they want to structure it, there are several options to do it successfully. Reaching the conclusion now on the development strategies that you can put in place when going to new countries. First, there are significant opportunities in the new markets, everything that has already been presented by Gunnar. So that's a first statement that is important to highlight. The second one on the finance part is that there are buyers for almost every profile of risk and in almost all markets. So if you are developing a project, there will be partners, and including experienced partners in offshore wind, to partner with you and co-develop the project. The Taiwan example gave a good example of what should be done and what should not. So Taiwan attracted a lot of players by putting a very clear target, long term, 2025 and then 2030, speaking about 10 gigawatt of fixed plus 10 gigawatt of floating. So that's what has to be done, but also created a lot of uncertainty by coming back on the tariff that was previously agreed, which is definitely and which puts the whole sector on hold. It has been frozen for several months. It's now back to almost normal, but certainly having a clear public support is very, very key. A clear public support, and in the long term, is very key for the development. And finally, indeed, as I said at the beginning, the premium to be paid for the new market is lower than most parties expected. There is a premium, it's logical, it's a higher risk, but a lot of what we have seen, a lot of what the industry has learned in the historical market can actually be used in these new markets. So yeah, all positive, a lot to do. If we want to build 500 gigawatts by 2050, we actually need 30 billion euro per year, more or less. So a lot of money to be raised as well, but there is appetite on those debt and equity markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clement. That's great, and some excellently positive messages as well there. You know, significant opportunities, buyers for every profile of risk, and LTOE premiums lower than expected, which is fantastic. I'd just like to note to everybody that the slides and recordings will be available to for people to listen to back to after this finishes, basically. So let's get to some questions which you guys have been sending in. We've had a range of questions on a number of different areas, so just deciding where we should start. Here's one on floating, which Clement, you may want to answer. So you mentioned that floating is obviously going to become more competitive, and we're looking almost towards 2030 as a cost competitive with fixed bottom wind. But as it's not yet a mature technology, what are the key signposts for commerciality?
Yeah, let me start on this one. I'm sure that Gunnar has a lot to add as well on this, but currently floating wind is something that is attracting more interest than other new sectors like wave or tidal or others for two reasons. The first one is that it is new, but it is also built on all the experience coming from offshore wind. A lot of what we see in floating offshore is actually an upgrade or actually, let's say, a difference within a sector, which is offshore wind, which is well understood. So it's not something completely new. And the second one, maybe even more importantly, is that the appetite to develop the floating offshore wind site is already huge, with many sites that have been identified. So there is a path for the market to develop quickly. And the main way to develop, well, at the same time, to develop the market, but also to bring the cost and the LCOE down, is to build enough for the industry to learn on what has been built. So a market where a lot of projects are in the pipe is a market where a lot of projects will be developed soon. Probably mistakes will be done for the first projects, and the novelty premium clearly will be paid for these first projects. We see it in the cost of debt and equity. But again, this novelty premium is not as high as it would be if it wasn't close to a sector that we now understand well, that is traditional offshore wind. And having the opportunity to build all these projects in the coming 5 years makes most of the industry very confident that the cost will fall and become competitive by 2030, because the one way to bring the cost down is basically to bring more capacity.
Great. Gunnar, have you got anything to add to that?
Maybe just one quick thing. I mean, I perfectly agree with Clement on everything. Maybe just one point to add could actually be the role of oil and gas companies when it comes to floating. Because, I mean, we already see more and more interest from the oil and gas industry, from companies such as, Equinor is already well placed in the market, but Shell and some of the Asian oil and gas companies are entering the offshore industry. And those companies would have a very deep understanding of working offshore, of offshore oil and gas structures. So there is the expectation that many of those companies could be particularly interested in floating and really use their floating oil and gas knowledge that they have from using floating structures in the oil and gas industry and transfer that knowledge to the offshore wind industry. And I think that could be a big push for floating that comes from the oil and gas industry.
And maybe just to add one point, because I should have started by this. It's true that now the industry moved on to the questions I've already highlighted, but from a technical point of view, the most advanced technologies are now tested. So technical advisors and even banks are comfortable with these most advanced technologies. And Equinor, for example, the High Wind Scotland has a capacity factor of I think 57% and an availability that is above 95%. I think there's been up to 97%. So and the same very good first feedback from the ideal prototype in France. So from a technical point of view, basically it floats. So it becomes more now an industrial challenge to make sure that, because obviously it's very big, it takes time to build. So one of the challenges is now less technical than industrial, and how quickly the foundations can be built for a commercial size project.
Yes, and I think that ties in again with what Gunnar just said about the oil and gas companies, and it's not just the developers. I mean, from my point of view, my role, talking to the industry on almost a daily basis and going out and finding companies that are looking to move into the sector, oil and gas, supply chain companies, massive amounts of interest from these guys, massive amounts of interest from the players that you don't normally expect to be finding in offshore wind, the ones who previously perhaps assumed that the industry was too small. Now we see with all the potential development opportunities globally that their skills will really come to bear as we try and reduce the LCOE down to a competitive level with offshore, make sure that floating is on an equal footing. So I've got some questions here about a few of the different markets which in your slides, Clement, when you identified sort of globally where the markets are, you coloured them in light green, I suppose, to suggest that they were perhaps future areas. So Brazil, India, some sort of southern Greece, and some southern European states, including Greece. So, firstly, to Gunnar, how do you see the offshore wind market expansion in Brazil, taking into account the status of the supply chain for onshore wind, but the slow movement towards the offshore?
Yeah, I think the light green countries are well, definitely what can happen in the future. So I've basically put in light green all the countries where some developers contacted us to help them finance their projects. So it's quite a broad understanding of what could happen. So the only thing that I know is that there are some developers trying to develop offshore wind in those countries, in Vietnam, in Greece and Brazil and so on. To be honest, all those countries are still quite far away and definitely much less advanced than the dark green countries, because most of them would need to have a stable support, and indeed, and coming back to our methodology, also a supply chain that would need to be developed. For Brazil, in your to answer to your question, my view is that it will take time. Obviously, we all know that Brazil, half of the population in South America lives in Brazil, so it's a very big country and massive need for electricity. But at the same time, a lot of place to develop onshore wind, a lot of hydropower, and PV as well. So I wouldn't bet on a very fast development, although I acknowledge that the developers who try to develop offshore wind have a case to diversify the mix of energies in the country, and obviously are well connected to local and central government. So it's more, I would say it's a post 2030 generation. In my opinion, obviously, if they manage to develop it more quickly, I'd be the first one to be very happy with that. But it's definitely further down the line.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think Clément is absolutely right. It will take some time, but I do think the potential for Brazil is actually quite promising. We are talking to players in Brazil. And I mean, there's already quite some momentum going on, and people talking about offshore wind and exploring possibilities. And I think what is quite promising would be the fact that the large demand centers, so the large cities, Rio and Sao Paulo especially, would be located directly by the coast. And I think that is always, I mean, the fundamental advantage that you can get from offshore wind, that you can have offshore wind farms near to those big demand centers, and you don't need to have them anywhere onshore, hundreds of thousands of miles away from the coastal areas where the demand usually is. And I think, therefore, looking from a sort of geographical perspective, Brazil seems to be quite well placed. And I think, yeah, it definitely needs some more development on a regulatory level. But I think the fundamentals are not looking too badly, and it's quite interesting. And therefore, I think definitely a market to watch in the future.
And it's true that we had the same reservation for Australia. So all large countries where you think why not develop onshore wind because there is space to develop it. And in the end, some local governments are definitely more interested in having a diversified mix of energy. And you probably have heard about the Star of South project in Australia that is now developed by CIP, very promising as well. So it is very possible that the same happens in Brazil if there is the support of some local governments, especially in the places indeed that are quite dense, close to the coast, and where building more onshore wind does not make as much sense as developing offshore wind close to the large cities. So yeah, that the more optimistic note, it can happen, but support from public governments will definitely be needed for that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a great, like you say, it's a great resource. I mean, the trade winds up the coast of Brazil are phenomenal and steady and constant, and offer a real good opportunity. We will actually be having a session dedicated to Brazil at the November Offshore and Floating Wind Conference in London, and we will be having representatives from Brazilian developers, and also the Brazilian government is seeking to come along to that and give their input. So that could be quite exciting there. I've got one talking about Poland, obviously another very interesting region, which is perhaps a little bit closer to being opened up than the Brazilian market, Poland and the Baltics. We're looking at sort of how do we get into the Polish market? What companies do we know that are already operating in a Polish market? And if you're looking to enter, what is your advice?
So for what is public, I mean, obviously I can only comment on what is public, right? But the three most advanced developers in Poland are Polenergia, PGE, and BTI. So that the projects that are most advanced in terms of going through early development and now mid-development. And the current discussions with the government and how the CFD will be put in place are quite promising. So definitely it's a market that is now, I still have an ongoing bet on what market will be the first to develop a commercial size project within France and Poland. So we'll see, but no, definitely it's a serious market where the most advanced projects are like really being developed now, and some other projects a bit less advanced are also now starting their development. So to answer the last question, that is how to enter the market, it really depends if it comes from a local Polish developer who wants to enter into offshore wind, or an international investor or developer wants to go to Poland. If it's the latter, then doing the partnership, as I was saying, a partnership with one of these local developers is key. In Poland, like anywhere, having the local knowledge and being able to speak to all the local stakeholders is an absolute condition to be able to develop it successfully. And if it comes from a Polish party, I would say first bring the local knowledge, so the engaging with the local community, including fishermen, but also local governments and national government, is very key to build a case before thinking of partnering with maybe a knowledgeable party in offshore wind. But yeah, the partnership, again, in my opinion, is a very a successful way to develop these projects.
Exactly, and just to add to that, I think we can also see this partnership approach, for example, taken by Equinor in the 50-50 joint venture with Pole Energia, where they also sort of join up to develop a larger offshore wind site. And I mean, I think the advantage that Poland has is that, in terms of sort of soil characteristics, I think that part of the Baltic Sea, would be assumed to be fairly similar to the German part of the Baltic Sea. There we already see some offshore wind farms. Therefore, I think in a way it's quite promising for Poland to take some of the lessons learned from the already the existing offshore wind farms in the Baltic Sea, and then develop, take the market forward. But I think Poland definitely one of the top European markets to watch.
Great. I mean, we have a number of questions which have not managed to get through, but unfortunately we've sort of run out of time now. I would say that there's been a number of questions on India and the potential for offshore wind in India, and we will be running a webinar later in the year, around early September time. So look out for our emails then, and we'll get you all clued up as to the opportunities which could be opening up in India in the next decade or so. Obviously, lots of potential there and lots to happen. So I'd like to thank Clement and Gunnar for joining us and for sharing their insights with us. Both Clement and Gunnar will be at the Offshore and Floating Wind Europe Conference in November on the 11th and 12th, and that's in Canary Wharf. And you're all welcome to join us. I'll be sending some more information in an email which comes out with the slides. But for now, I just want to say thank you to our two presenters and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for organizing, Dominic.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.